Hi, everyone. This is David with Overthink. I'm here to talk today about the concept of the sense of reality, which we find in the writings of the psychologist and philosopher William James, based on his book, The Varieties of Religious Experiences, which is a really nice and easy read, about 500 pages, so it's long, but it's a fast read, that was based on a series of lectures that William James gave in Harvard in 1901 and 1902. Actually, the talks were scheduled to be given a couple of years earlier, but some health problems got in the way of James delivering them. But by the time he delivered them, it became clear to him and his audience that he had stumbled upon a pretty original way of thinking about religion that deserved to be published as a book. And so what you get here are these lectures that are written with a live audience in mind. So it makes them very digestible, very easy to follow, but they still have a good amount of philosophically important content. And the concept that I want to focus on today is James's notion of the sense of reality, which he believes is at the root of our religious experiences, independently of what variety of religious experience we're talking about. But before I talk about that concept, we have to do a little bit of build up in terms of understanding what is going on in this book. So the first thing to note is that William James is a psychologist, and I mean, he studied medicine. He spent some time even in Brazil studying natural history. So he has the mind of a scientist, first and foremost, and a scientist with a very clearly empirical orientation. And that is going to be reflected in his approach to psychology. Now, his interest here is on religious experiences as a lived phenomenon. So he's not interested in a religious dogma or scriptural interpretation or organized religion. And he makes it very clear that what draws him to the subject of religion is the way in which people live their experiences of the divine. And so he begins the book by positioning himself between two different currents of thought that he sees as dominating religious studies and that he believes we need to move away from in order to give a coherent account of religious experience in all of its varieties. Now, the first of those traditions is what he calls medical materialism. And medical materialism is just the idea, quite common at the end of the 19th century, that if somebody has a certain belief, it must be correlated and maybe even caused by some organic underlying principle that can be traced to the brain or to the nervous system. So there's got to be an organic explanation for the way of thinking that we find in that person. So, for example, if somebody believes in God, maybe there's something going on in a particular part of the brain, or maybe some neural connection is not happening in the way that it should, or maybe there is an unnecessary growth in some part of the nervous system. Whatever explanation you want to insert here, medical materialism always looks for a organic explanation for beliefs and attitudes that might influence people's worldview. And according to James, there are two main problems with medical materialism. The first one is that it delegitimizes the experiences that it seeks to explain because it just tries to reduce them to an anatomical or physiological explanation rooted in whatever the latest medical understanding of the relationship between mind and body might be. So that's the first problem, that it's not respectful to the irreducibility of various experiences that we have and that carry meaning for us independently of whatever their origin might be. The second problem of medical materialism is that it is, in a sense, a self-defeating position, because if you believe that beliefs are always caused or can be traced back to an organic origin, then in order for you to be consistent about that claim, you have to also accept that your own belief that beliefs are organically caused is itself organically caused. And so he tries to get medical materialism in a double bind or in a contradiction, because of course most people who defend medical materialism would say that about the beliefs of other people, but they would not feel so comfortable saying that their own philosophical and theoretical position is ultimately reducible to maybe hyperactivity in some part of their right or left hemisphere. And so medical materialism for James is one of those currents that is dominating, especially empirical psychology in the 19th century, and that we need to move away from if we want to understand, and this is the key point, if we want to understand what religion means to the individuals who organize their lives around it. Now, the second current that James tells us we need to move away from in thinking about religious experience is what he calls dogmatic theology. And you can think of dogmatic theology quite simply as organized religion or as the position of people who believe in the truth of whatever religious dogma they embrace. And so he says, look, I'm not going to adopt medical materialism because I think that's reductive and does not do justice to the complexity of the phenomenon of lived religious experience. But at the same time, I'm not interested in questions of the truth of or falsity of various religious positions, right? I don't care if there is or if there isn't free will, if there is one or many worlds, if God is fundamentally good or evil. What I care about is how people incorporate those beliefs into the web of their worldview, really. And so by positioning himself between these two traditions, James adopts what he calls an empiricist criterion for thinking about religion, where he says, if you want to understand a religious experience, you have to understand it, quote unquote, by its fruits, i.e., by what it actually allows people to do in their everyday lives, by how it changes their relationship to themselves and their relationship to the world. And so this is where you already begin to see the very close connection that there is between James's way of thinking about religious experience and the rising program of pragmatism, American pragmatism, a school of thought in philosophy that foregrounds the practical value of things rather than their theoretical properties. And so the notion that what is important is what works is already in this text. And in fact, in reading this text for the first time, I noticed that William James already uses here the concept of cash value, where he makes an allusion to the fact that what matters about certain ideas is the cash value that they have, i.e., what they actually allow you to do with them. So a pragmatic empiricist criterion. Now, James talks about religion, and that means that he has to give a definition of what religious experience is. So this is his definition of religion in this empiricist vein. Religion, therefore, as I now ask you arbitrarily to take it, shall mean for us the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, as far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. End quote. Page 31 of the book. So once again, because there are a couple of things that I want to highlight about this, religion is the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude as far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. And so two observations about this quote is first that it foregrounds the subjective. So it's about feelings, acts, and experiences. It's not about religious dogma, and it's not about second order objective explanations from scientists about what's happening in the brain or in the body in the case of people who have religious beliefs. So that's the first thing, the focus on the subjective. The second thing I want to highlight, and here I'm just going to raise it as a question for us to think about, is why James defines religion as these experiences specifically of individual men in their solitude. And I obviously, I'm not here making the point about gender. I think he's using the term men problematically as the universal for human. But my interest here is on why he thinks that religious feelings and acts can only happen to people individually in the context of their solitude. So, to what extent might that presuppose a certain view of religion that maybe is less universal than James himself seems to believe? So, the focus on solitude here strikes me as potentially subject to critique, but I'll leave that for another time. Now, the third thing I want to mention here is that it's the feelings, acts, and experiences of people in their solitude insofar as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they consider the divine. And so it's not that he presupposes a conception of divinity or a particular understanding of God. People can have religious experiences in connection to whatever it is that they individually consider the divine. So there is a pluralism here in this definition that is not only consistent with the pragmatic empiricist orientation of the lectures, but that is also welcoming of religious differences. So people with very different belief systems can have religious experiences in this Jamesian sense. Now, in thinking about these feelings and experiences, he recognizes that that's a very broad definition and that it could raise some problems. And so he then offers a couple of clarifications as to what a religious experience in his sense is. And I'll talk about that before I finally conclude by talking about the central concept, which is what he calls the sense of reality. Now, if we just talk about people having certain feelings about the divine, there are many ways in which those feelings can go. Some people can have a very committed relationship to the divine, rooted in faith. Other people could say, well, I've thought about it. I really don't think that there is divinity in the world. I think that's absurd. So maybe for me, divinity is just whatever, like the flying spaghetti monster, or something, insert here something even more ridiculous than that, like, oh, for me religion is my cat is the divine. And so James introduces a clarification where he says, even though my concept is very broad, it requires a couple of things. Number one, it requires seriousness on the part of the subject that is having these experiences. And that's his way of undercutting the possibility of a cynical character suddenly claiming to have religious experiences. So the person that says, my cat is my God, according to James, that's not a position of seriousness, something that you truly, truly believe, and therefore it doesn't count as a religious experience. The second clarification that he adds, and all of this is in the first 100 pages of the book, he says, my understanding of religious experience does not require an actual God. And I think this is a very important point because he says there are systems of thought out there that incorporate a notion of divinity, but that do not presuppose a God, whether that God be inhuman or whether that God be anthropomorphized in one way or another. And he says, two examples of belief systems that are religious in my sense and that I embrace and I want to understand more, but that don't have a deity in the traditional sense, are the writings of Emerson. So there's the American transcendentalists here with their views about nature as itself transcendent and divine would count for him as a naturalistic religion. And so you could have a religious experience being an Emersonian. Another example is Buddhism. According to James, there is no deity in the traditional sense in Buddhist metaphysics. And so here we have another example of a religion without a God. So you do need to be serious, but you don't need to have a God. Finally, and this is the third clarification that he introduces, what you do also need on top of that sense of seriousness is what he calls a higher emotion in the context of the experience. And so when somebody has a religious experience, he says it has to have this kind of affective fullness to it. The experience really draws you out of yourself and it fills you with a kind of happiness or joy or a sense of being lifted. And that means that a religious experience is very different than philosophy. Because in philosophy, he says, You can have uplifting ideas, but they're always purely rational ideas. They're ideas that you have to work logically through, in that require a sense of effort and volition, right? You have to think hard about some of these questions. For instance, is there a God? Is there a beginning to time? Is the universe finite or infinite? You can approach these questions philosophically, i.e., through mental effort, but that's very different than what happens in a truly religious experience, which is that the insight that you gain or your conversion to a certain position fills you with a kind of joy that, as he says, requires no volition and no effort. It just takes you over, and it gives you that happy mind or that higher emotion that philosophy will never attain. And so, what we have so far then is that we have James with this empiricist approach to religion. It's neither medical materialism nor dogmatic theology that defines it in terms of feelings, actions, and experiences. And that tells us that in order to have the right kind of experience, it needs to be you in a relationship to your conception of the divine in such a way that you are serious and that you have a higher emotion, even if there is no traditional God involved, although there could be. Now, all of this, now to bring it to the concept that interests us, is rooted in his understanding of what he calls a sense of reality. According to James, we all, human beings, we all are born with this sense for the real, that according to him allows us to navigate the world. It's just part of the architecture of our minds and bodies. It just comes for free with the kinds of beings that we are. Now, this sense of reality typically works together with the senses, with hearing, vision, taste, etc., to construct for us a world of experience, right? So, like, this is real right now. I see it, I touch it. So, from my senses, I gather information that then my sense of reality infuses with this solidity that makes that stuff real for me. So, think about the sense of reality almost as a kind of power that we have to distinguish between what's real and what's not real. And typically, the sense of reality, again, works in close conjunction and in close collaboration with the organs of sense. The point that then allows James to make a leap from this to religion is that he argues that this sense of reality, or what he calls the sense of objective presence, works with the senses, but is not limited to the senses. And so there are some cases in which our sense of reality latches onto things, ideas, notions that are not produced by the senses, and then infuses them with this kind of sense of objectivity and reality, making us experience the thing in question as if it truly is there, as a real part of the universe. And he says, essentially, religious experiences happen whenever concepts like the concept of God become the object of our sense of reality, such that our sense of reality is not necessarily working exclusively with the senses. It's suddenly working with something that comes from somewhere else, right? Maybe it comes from tradition, from convention, or from our own intellect. We start thinking about the idea of God, we produce the idea of God, and then our sense of reality latches onto it and gives it this sense of the real, such that we experience God or the infinite or the divine as being just as real as this shelf or as these sets of books that I have behind me. And so the sense of reality really lies at the root of James's understanding of religion, because it is what explains the fervor and the intensity of religious belief. Because, just a few seconds ago, I even used the term, we act as if it's real, as if the concept of God is real. But James would actually criticize that articulation, because people who are religious, they're not acting as if God is real. they believe God is real. And in fact, this is James's critique of Kant's theory of religion from the second critique, the critique of practical reason in this book. He says the problem with the Kantian view of religion and religious faith is that Kant uses the language of the as if. And James says that's a really uncouth, that's the term that he uses for criticizing Kant. That's a really uncouth way of understanding religious belief because it minimizes and trivializes the true belief of the religious subject in whatever it is that they consider the divine. And so the sense of reality doesn't lead us to act as if things are real. It makes things real for us. And that's the origin of the many varieties of religious experiences for James.